Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. It's Rabbi Akiva Males. Today is Wednesday. It is the 20th of July, and we're getting ready for Parshas Pinchas. I have an incredible source I want to share with you today. It's something that I stumbled on several years ago, and I always meant to get back to it, and I had some time this week to get back to it and spend more time on it. And I want to share it with you because this is going to change our understanding of something that I, at least for me, something that I thought I had a grasp of until I saw this. So let's see. In the Parsha this week in Pinchas, we find reference made once again to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was not going to go into Israel because of the sin of hitting the rock, what's known as Mei Meriva, the sin that occurred at the waters of strife. That was when Bnei Yisrael started to panic, was after Miriam died. They started to panic thinking that they would no longer have their be'er, their wellspring of water that had kept them alive in the wilderness for all those years. And Moshe gets upset with Bnei Yisrael. Hashem says, speak to the rock. Moshe, instead of speaking to the rock, strikes the rock. And we're told that both him and Aaron then receive the very severe punishment of not being allowed to enter into the land of Israel. Let's see how it comes up in this week's Parsha in Pinchas. Pasuk tells us it's in Perek Chav Zayin, chapter 27, Yud Beis. We'll see a couple psukim. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, God says to Moshe, Alei el har ha'avarim hazeh. He tells Moshe to go and ascend this mountain that's known as Har Avarim. Ureis Aretz Asher Nasati L'Bnei Israel. I want you to take a good look at the land that I'm going to give to Israel. You won't be able to enter that land, but I want you at least to see it and realize what kind of a special place Bnei Israel are going into. Yud Gimel, Risiyosa, take a very good look at it. And after having done that, you will be gathered to your people. That's a euphemism for passing away. You will experience the same death that your brother Aaron experienced. And all the Mefarshim say, Moshe was very envious of the peaceful death that Aaron experienced, and God is assuring him, you'll also have that same very peaceful death. It was called Misa Beneshika, dying with a kiss from God, meaning no suffering, no pain, nothing, just lay down and you would expire. One more, Pasuk Yodalid, Kasher Merisem Pi, and why did you and Aaron not merit going into the land of Israel? Kasher Merisem Pi, B'midbar Tzin. Because you disobeyed my command in the wilderness of sin, in Merivas Aida, when the congregation quarreled, and you were supposed to sanctify me through that incident with water to their eyes. You were supposed to speak to the rock, and instead you struck the rock. Hey, May Merivas Kadesh Midbar Sin, and this is the place that's known as the water of dispute. That's in the region of Kadesh. That's in the wilderness of sin. So we're reminded once again that Moshe is not entering into the land of Israel, and Hashem tells us exactly again why is it? What's the reason why Moshe is not going to go into the land of Israel? Rashi here quotes both the Gemara and the Medrash. We're looking at the end of that Rashi. The Rashi says, "Kasher nesaf Aaron achicha mikan shenisav Moshe lemisaso shel Aaron." So this is what we spoke out earlier: is that when Hashem tells Moshe that you'll have the same death that Aaron had, is because Moshe was envious, saying, wow, that's the way to go. Misa beneshika, just to die with a kiss from God and not having to suffer, not to be ill, not anything debilitating. Moshe was envious of such a misa, of such a death. So Hashem reassures him, that's the type of death you'll experience. Okay, then I have three dots we're going to see a little later in Rashi. B'chol makom shekasav misasam. He says, you'll notice that every time that the Torah speaks about the death of Aharon and Moshe, Kasav Sirchonam. It also writes, what is it that they did? What wrong did they commit that they did not merit going into the land of Israel? Why? God had issued a decree on the generation of the wilderness that they would die in the wilderness because they did not trust in God, they didn't believe in God after the sin of the spies, the Meraglim. So Moshe, so to say, put in a request from God. Do me a favor, God. I do not want to be associated with that terrible sin that Bnei Yisrael all experienced, the sin, and that's the reason why they're not going, that generation of men are not going into the wilderness because of the sin of the spies. I don't want anyone to make a mistake who's going to read the Torah in later generations, that's the reason why I didn't merit going into the land of Israel. Therefore, favor, whenever you refer to my passing in the wilderness, please put it in context that the reason why I passed in the wilderness, the reason why I did not merit to go into the land of Israel was because of the sin of hitting the rock. That's what Rashi is saying here, quoting the Medrash and the Gemara. So one more time. Whenever the Torah mentions the death of Aaron and Moshe, it also mentions what they did wrong. Because a decree had been issued on the generation of the wilderness, to die in the wilderness, because of the sin they didn't trust in God, it didn't sin to the spies. So therefore Moshe put in a special request to God. Whenever you talk about me or Aaron passing away in the wilderness, put it in context. Say what we did wrong. I don't want anyone to think that we were involved in that sin of the spies. I don't want anyone to make the mistake of thinking that I was one of the people who rebelled against God and thought that you couldn't accomplish bringing us into the land of Israel. So it was a special request that Moshe and Aaron had put in, and here it is. You see God's granting it. Because here, when God's mentioning that, Moshe, you're going to die in the wilderness, he says that again. What's the reason? Because of what happened by Mei Meriva, by the waters of strife that you struck the rock and did not speak to it. A little bit more in that ended at Rashi, wherever the deaths, the passing of Moshe and Aaron are mentioned, the Torah also mentions what they did wrong. Lohodia, this is to inform us that the only thing that Moshe and Aaron had in the column in their ledger book of misdoings, of misdeeds that they had committed during their time, this is it. Mei Meriva, speaking, instead of speaking to the rock, they hit it, and that's what's going on. So it's a chesed. I may have looked at the psukim and said, "Oy, Hashem keeps dredging up what they did wrong." In Moshe's opinion, is no, I want you to mention that because I never want anyone to make the mistake of thinking the reason that I died in the wilderness together with all of Bnei Israel is because I somehow didn't trust in God after an incident of the spies. So Moshe and Aaron put in a special request. Whenever you talk about us dying in the wilderness, make sure to mention the reason we died in the wilderness was because of Mei Meriva, was not because of the sin of the spies. I also brought down here Rashi from Parshas Chukas. Here it is in Parshas Chukas. You'll see here, it's in Perek Chaf. Here's when Aaron dies. So again, it says, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, God says to Moshe, Vel Aaron bar Ahor, when they were at Horahor, that was one mountain on top of the other, Al Gvul Eretz Edom Lemor, which was right by the border of Edom. So here's what God says, Yeah, Seif Aaron el Amav, Aaron, prepare yourself to be gathered to your people. That's again a euphemism for passing away. Aaron, you will not enter into the land that I'm giving to the Jewish people. You will not enter into that land. Again, here's the reason. Because you rebelled against me by Mei Meriva. There it is. So again, so you see when Aaron passes away, the pasuk makes a point of saying the reason why Aaron didn't go into the land was because of Mei Meriva, the sin that occurred when Moshe hit the rock and started speaking to it. And also whenever Moshe's passing is mentioned, there too, it is mentioned as well. That is what Rashi quoting the Gemara and the Medrash, what it informs us. And you see that plays itself out. You see that it plays itself out whenever their deaths are mentioned. Okay, I've always read that. Maybe you've always read that, and you've taken it for granted. Yeah, if we were to ask anyone, why did Moshe and Aaron not go into the land of Israel? It seems very clear in the Torah. The Torah is very upfront that Hashem says the reason why Moshe and Aaron don't go into the land of Israel, the pasuk says, is because what occurred at Mei Meriva by the waters of strife. And I think I always just stopped there. I always had some questions. I never really understood what happened, what was the big crime, but I never really went further. I'm going to share with you today an incredible source. I don't know how many people are aware of this source, even people who've had a full yeshiva education, because this is just not a common source. But it's really important to know. And when I saw this several years ago, it was mind-blowing. And again, I made a note. I want to get back to this. And I had a chance this week to get back into it. So let's just give a brief introduction about the author. One of our classic commentators on the Torah is always referred to as Abarbanel. Some people will pronounce it Abravanel. however you pronounce it, it's the same person. And his name was Rabbi Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel. Here, this is just a blurb I found on an OU website that had a brief blurb about him. It's not the whole thing, but let's just read it together. He's got a fascinating story. So his years were 1437 to 1508. Abarbanel was a remarkable figure, combining within himself multiple talents, including that of statesman, financier, biblical commentator, philosopher, protector of his people. He lived in the twilight years of the Middle Ages, and his life and times reflected the transition between the Middle Ages and the modern period. Again, he's in that fascinating time period around the same time as the Maharal of Prague, which is right in between the era of the Rishonim and the Achronim. So he would be considered from the very, very early Achronim. Whereas right after that time period of the Rishonim, the early commentators end, and the Achronim begins, that's exactly where Abarbanel and pretty much the Maharal also around that same time. So they're from the earliest of the Achronim. And then you'll find the Ramah of Moshe Isserles comes on right around that time, a little bit after that as well. So let's see, what was Abarbanel's story? Abarbanel was born in Lisbon, that's Portugal. He received a wide-ranging education in 1571. So that's later in his life. King Alfonso of Portugal captured 250 Jews in North Africa who were to be sold into slavery. Under the leadership of Abarbanel, a huge ransom was provided to secure their release. He served as a treasurer to King Alfonso until he was forced to move to Castile and eventually entered the service of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1484. I'm tempted to say that should have been in 1471. You see up above, it said in 1571, King Alfonso of Portugal. That should have been 1471, because look, Abarbanel passed away in 1508. And it's talking about in his early years in Portugal before he went to Spain. So that's a mistake on their site there. That should be 1471, not 1571. I'm going to correct that in my handout when I get back to shul. Okay, and it says he entered into the service of Ferdinand and Isabella until 1484. That's in Spain. Despite his political influence, he was unable to prevent the expulsion in 1492. That was that devastating expulsion of Spanish Jewry that occurs in 1492, and refused the king's offer to remain at his post, choosing instead to throw in his lot with his people. So again, just to remind ourselves of Jewish history, Jews have lived in Spain for over 1,000 years, and comes 1492, the Jews were given an ultimatum, is that the king of Spain and his wife, who was Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen had decided they were very, very radical in their belief of Catholicism and practice of Catholicism, and they did not want to have anyone who was not Catholic in their kingdom. So everyone was given the following ultimatum. You've got until the summer of 1492 to make a decision. If you want to remain a different faith community, you got to get out of our country, and you can't take too much of your resources or wealth with you. And that's what so many Jews did. That was called the Spanish expulsion, the summer of 1492. Those Jews who did not wish to remain, who wanted to hang on to their Yiddishkeit, they left. They were forced to pick up and leave. Those who decided to stay behind had to become Christian. They had to convert and become practicing Catholics. There were many Jews who chose to do that. They were called anusim, those who were compelled. They saw themselves as being compelled to convert. They weren't up for the challenge of picking up and exiling themselves. Many of them had the best of intentions, thinking, okay, outwardly will profess to be Catholics, but we'll still try to practice our Judaism on the secret. They were known as anusim, an impolite nickname they were given was Marranos, which in Spanish was a pejorative that meant swine. And once people converted, now they were subject to the office of the Inquisition. The Inquisition's job was set up within the church to really vet out any of the new Christians, those who had converted and become Christian, to make certain that they were no longer practicing any of their heretical beliefs, anything that was not Christianity. So if someone had converted from Islam to Christianity, they were subject to an Inquisition. If someone converted from Judaism to Christianity, they were subject to an Inquisition. The Inquisition only had power over those who had taken on Christianity. So that's what happened. In 1492, people were given the choice. If you want to retain your original faith, you got to leave the country. If you want to stay here, you've got to convert. Once they convert, they were subject to the Inquisition. And that was a very dark chapter in Jewish history. Thousands and thousands of Jews did not have the strength to leave. They chose to stay behind. They thought they could live this double life, Ultimately, it proved to either be a death wish, because if they got caught, they would be burnt at the stake after being tortured terribly. And if they didn't get caught, families can't live that way for too long. Many of their children just became really lost and swallowed up into Spanish society. Sadly enough, many Jews had the strength to leave Spain and not convert, went to Portugal. It wasn't too long until Portugal did the same thing. So there were numerous Jews who said, I can't do this again. I did this once. I picked up and left everything and my belongings behind in Spain to come to Portugal. I can't do it again. I'll be a converso in Portugal. And again, sadly, the Inquisition, they were subject to the Inquisition. And those who didn't get caught, many of them and their children and families just got swallowed up, absorbed into Portuguese society. Very, very dark and sad chapter in Jewish history. Be that as it may, at the time in 1492, Abarbanel, he was working in the cabinet for the Spanish king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella. And he tried to do everything he could as a statesman to prevent the expulsion. He was not successful. Jewish tradition has it that he was given an exemption, that he would be allowed to stay. His services were so desired by the king and queen and their court that he would be allowed to stay if even if he would not convert. And the Jewish tradition is that he threw in his lot with his people. He said, absolutely not. I'm with my people. So that's what the OU's got here. Despite his political influence, he was unable to prevent the expulsion of 1492, refused the king's offer to remain at his post, choosing instead to throw in his lot with his people. He then lived in Naples, that's in Italy, Corfu, and finally in Venice, all in Italy, where he died. As far as I know, nobody knows where his grave is. I was once listening to a lecture from Rabbi Wein, and it's astonishing. Here was someone who was such a leader of Bnei Yisrael at that time period, who was such a prolific author, and there's no tradition as to where he's buried. Most of his writings were composed in his later years when he was free of governmental responsibilities, and he wrote an astonishing long commentary to Chumash and to the rest of Tanakh as well. Let's see one more brief paragraph. Abarbanel's commentaries on Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, are unique and represent a fresh departure in the depth of his questions and analysis and the originality of his interpretations. All subsequent commentators must take note of his questions, even if they do not agree with his answers. And let me explain what that means. What that means is as follows. Abarbanel, the way he structures his perush is absolutely fascinating. He does this, he doesn't go, he's not like a standard commentator that is, just running a running commentary on every chapter and verse. What he does is he opens up, sometimes it's one chapter, one parak, sometimes it's a couple, and he'll list off a number of questions, 10 questions, 7 questions, 18 questions, basically say for this next chunk, next parak, the next chapter or 2 chapters, whatever it is, you cannot claim to understand it if you avoid these 10 questions. If you want to claim to understand, you must deal with these 10, 12, whatever number it is, you have to deal with these questions, and he sets them up. You can't ignore them. They are such logical questions. Now, and that's what the OU is saying here. You might argue with his response. You might not like his answers, but you have to agree. You cannot claim to understand this parak unless you address these questions. So very often, if someone has a really good question, I always try to go to my Abarbanel and see, okay, did the Abarbanel raise the question? Now, what's so challenging about the Abarbanel, and a lot of this has to do with the way it was printed over the years. It's not printed in a very user-friendly manner. And I have seen some attempts in more recent printings trying to address this. The section where Abarbanel lists his questions, that's very user-friendly because that's always broken up into a paragraph. Every question is a paragraph. The problem is the way it's been published over the years is after the list of questions is written, he then just has, and again, you can't blame this on him, it was the publisher, you just have page after page after page of commentary, not broken down into paragraphs or not broken down into topics that address those questions. So you have to really have the patience to sit through it and say, okay, where does the section begin where he's dealing with question number 3 through 4? And then where's the section about 5 through 6? You can find it, but it takes time. It's not easy. So I have seen some recent publishers who have been republishing the Abarbanel where they've tried to address that challenge, But be that as it may, this is the challenge. His commentary is fascinating, but it's just the way it's been published over the years is not user-friendly. Okay, be that as it may. I want to share with you one of the most fascinating pieces of Abarbanel that I've seen over the years. This is in Parshas Chukas. Parshas Chukas is where the sin of Mei Meriva happens. That's where the incident occurs, when Miriam dies, and after she dies, Bnei Yisrael begins to panic, thinking that they no longer have a source of water, and that's when they start to complain. Hashem tells Moshe, go speak to the rock, and he gets frustrated with Bnei Yisrael. He calls them a rebellious people, and then instead of speaking to the rock, he hits it, and that's when he gets punished, and Aaron gets punished as well. Let's take a look at what Abarbanel does here. So he says, "Vayvo bnei Yisrael midbar Tzin." They enter into the wilderness of Tzin, and he says the next piece of commentary is going to go from here ad vayishlach Moshe malachim u'kadesh until he sends out the messengers to the king of Moab or Edom from Kadesh. V'roi lahir lishol b'psukim elu vinyanim. He says you've got to look at this. I just got a message that says our meeting's going to end in 10 minutes. That means it's only giving us a half hour of time. Oh my gosh. All right. It could be since the pandemic started, Zoom is now cutting down the time that they're giving us. All right. We've got 10 minutes. Let's get this in. Okay. So he says as follows. He says, he says, we're going to ask a number of questions. If you want to understand what's going on here, the following questions have to be dealt with. And you'll see they're a little bit lengthy. We won't do them all inside, but let's see them. Aleph, Hashela Aleph. What's the first question? Why did Moshe and Aaron get hit with such a heavy decree that they can't enter Israel? If their sin was that they hit the rock, or if their sin was that they insulted Bnei Israel by calling them a rebellious people. He says his first question is that doesn't seem to have been such a big deal, and that's a horrible punishment that they're receiving, not entering the land of Israel. Was their crime that bad? Was hitting the rock that bad? It still made a Kiddush Hashem. What did Hashem say? You didn't make it. It could have been a bigger Kiddush Hashem. If you spoke to the rock and the rock listened and gave out its water, well, that would have been a bigger Kiddush Hashem. But it wasn't still a miracle that water came out when it was hit. Stuff like that doesn't happen. That's still a miracle. That's his first question. Question number two, Ashela Beis. The general operating principle of God is that he works mida keneged mida, measure for measure. He works measure for measure when he gives out punishments. How does this crime fit? How does the punishment fit the crime? What connection is there between? It's got to be measure for measure. What connection is between hitting a rock? Now you're not allowed to go into Israel. That seems as if we're not following. We're not following the crime. It's a punishment that's not fitting the crime. That was the second question. Let's go to his third question. Hashela Gimel, his third question. Hinei Moshe hikatzur. Okay, Moshe was the one who hit the rock. Or you're going to tell me the crime was that he called them rebellious people. Aaron did nothing wrong here. Why is Aaron being punished for Mei Meriva? He seems not to have been a participant. He wasn't the one who hit the rock. He wasn't the one who called the Jews a rebellious people. Why is Aaron being punished? These are all excellent questions. Hashela Daled, what's his fourth question? In Mishnah Torah, meaning that's Sefer Devarim, and we'll get to him soon, at the beginning of Sefer Devarim, when Moshe is reviewing the history of what occurred all the years in the wilderness, he says an expression, Gambi hisanaf Hashem biglalchem, is that God also got mad at me because of you and said, I can't go into Israel. You have to look at the context of that. What was Moshe saying? Gambi hisanaf Hashem biglalchem. He had just talked to Bnei Israel about the terrible sin that occurred at the Meraglim, the Chet Meraglim, the sin of the spies. And then he says, God got upset at me because of that and said, I can't go into Israel. What are you talking about? That has nothing to do with why Moshe can't go into Israel. The reason Moshe can't go into Israel is because of Mei Meriva, hitting the rock. What does he mean in Sefer Devarim that somehow or another this is linked to the sin of the spies, why he can't go into Israel? Excellent question. Hashela, hey, what's his fifth question? Lama Moshe Aaron Lotzak Liba Mel Hashem. Why do we not find anywhere in the Torah? Okay, there's allusions like in Ves Hanan. There's an allusion. There's a rabbinic tradition that Moshe had been praying over and over again to God. Let me go into the land of Israel, and Hashem finally says enough. But nowhere in the Torah do you find Moshe and Aaron praying like their lives depend on it, that they want to go into Israel, begging God to rescind this terrible punishment. How do we make sense of this? If this punishment totally doesn't fit the crime, Aaron seems to have been patched and got this slap that he didn't deserve. There's no Mida Keneged Mida. What's going on? Why weren't they spending the rest of the next 38 years? Why were they not spending the next 38 years screaming and crying, saying that we want to, that we want to? I'm sorry, not the next 38 years, because Mei Meriva happened in the 38th year. Why from the moment of Mei Meriva, of hitting the rock, why are they not screaming and crying, saying we want to go into the land of Israel? These are and they have to be addressed. That's what our Barbanel is saying. You cannot claim to understand the incident of Mei Meriva without addressing these questions. And here's what he says. We're not going to read it all because our time's not going to allow it. We have, this is interesting. Zoom has changed the allowance of how much time they give us. We have 5 minutes left. So let me share with you what a Barbanel does. A Barbanel says, we'll just read a little bit. He says, V'daiti b'zeh, what's my interpretation? Shemoshe Aaron Shneim Ne'anashu, both Moshe and Aaron were punished ba'avor avono she'asu. They were not punished because of Mei Meriva. Each one of them had a unique misdeed that they had committed, and that's the reason they were punished. What was Aaron's? Im Aaron ba'avon ego. The real reason why Aaron was punished was because Aaron was the one who played a role in building of the Egel Hazav, the golden calf. We know Aaron had the best of motivations. He knew Moshe was coming down. He saw Bnei Yisrael panicking, and he says, oh my gosh, if I just leave them to themselves, if I try to stop them and not build Avodah Zarah, then they're going to kill me like they killed Hor. So instead, what Aaron does is he says, I'm not going to leave them for themselves, because there are all these thousands and thousands of people. If they start, they're going to build Avodah Zarah. It'll be done in 5 minutes. They'll start offering offerings. It'll happen. What instead I'll do is I'll say, I'll be the one to build it. I'll build the Mizbeach. I'll do it slowly. I'll delay the process till Moshe comes down. He says, I'll be the one to build an idol. I'll do it slowly. And sure enough, by the time I'm done, Moshe is going to certainly come down. Aaron had the best of motivations. He was trying to slow down the process. But be that as it may, his actions resulted in the building of the golden calf. And as a result of the building of the golden calf, thousands of members of Bnei Yisrael sinned and died or were put to death. So there is Mida Keneged Mida. Mida Keneged Mida is that was really what Aaron did wrong. And even though he had the best of intentions, he played a role in the Egel Hazav, and therefore Hashem says that's why you're getting spanked. That's why he's going to get patched, not going into the land of Israel. And it's Mida Keneged Mida. He played a role in the downfall of so many Jews who couldn't go into the land of Israel. He also won't go into the land of Israel. So then why does the Torah pin it on Mei Meriva? That's totally to save Aaron the embarrassment of ever being associated with the golden calf, because his sin in the golden calf was worlds apart from those who were full-fledged worshipers of it. That's the Barbanel's approach, that this was all a smokescreen. The Mei Meriva was not the real reason they were punished. It's all a smokescreen. It's wild. And he says, what about Moshe? What did Moshe do wrong? He says the real reason why Moshe was punished was his role in the Meraglim. What does that mean? Hashem, when he gave his consent to send in the Meraglim, God gave a very limited set of instructions about what is it that they should do. The Meraglim should go in and see what's the best route to take to enter into the land, which cities should we conquer first. That's what Hashem authorized. Moshe expanded what their mission was. Moshe says, find out, are they a strong people or weak people? How strong are their cities? Are they fortresses or are they open villages? And once Moshe expanded the mission and they came back with a more expanded report, that caused the despair and the loss of morale that everyone suffered. And that's what brought everyone to rebel and say, we don't want to go anymore. We want to go back to Egypt. And that's why the whole generation was hit with the punishment about not going into the land of Israel. And because of that, that's why it was real Mida Keneged Mida, why Moshe is not going to go into the land of Israel. And this is Abarbanel's approach, that the whole thing of Mei Meriva is a smokescreen. That's not really what they did wrong. That was an effort on God's part to protect their dignity. I have here on page 4, just to show you, he now takes this and he says, there are at least 13 points, 13 reasons why this fits like a glove. And he goes through 13 ways to show how his approach will fit like a glove into the Torah. It's radical, and it totally changes Because again, a plain reading of the text says that what Moshe and Aaron did wrong was Meriva. He says, no, that's all a smokescreen. They really had different crimes. Aaron's crime, Aaron's misdeed was playing a role in the golden calf, even though it had the best of intentions, what the result of it was awful. And Moshe's crime, Moshe's misdeed, was the fact that he expanded what Hashem had authorized by the Meraglim, the mission of the spies, and his expansion and asking him to come back with a larger report. That's what brought about all the despair, and that's how it happened. Look here again at the beginning of Parshas Devarim. You see that Barbanel. I just brought it in 2 lines where he says this. He says, "V'omer shedaiti bezehu." My opinion is she'Aaron kadosh Hashem meis bavon ego. Aaron's real crime was the sin of the calf. Moshe Adonenu meis bavon meraglim. That was his real crime. Lo she'yanido me'avon ego. It's not that Aaron was guilty for the same reason as everyone else who died in ego. They were not as guilty as the others. Then last line, this moment after the sin of hitting the rock, Hashem says, okay, I'm going to use this as camouflage, and I'm going to say this is the reason